Greetings, brethren and sisterin of every hue. Welcome to the first in a series of personal blogs. And it's nearly been a full week since I went on the BBC's This Week to discuss Cameron's institutional racism comments with Andrew Neil, Michael Portillo and Alan Johnson. It was a very eye-opening, illuminating and interesting experience. But there was only so much that I could convey in a 10-minute segment. Except now we've got the internet. So if you've got time, pull up a chair, join me over a cup of English breakfast tea. Made in India. Now, I believe that all these apparently unrelated race statements are connected. All the changes that people are agitating for are not cosmetic, but are fundamental questions. I've had some time to reflect, and I think it's clear that the outlook that you have on this subject is heavily determined by your starting premise. Some people will see diversity as a really positive thing for unis and for Britain as a whole. We're going to have more colourful, nuanced narratives, varied interpretations, and will prevent a slide into ignorance. Everybody gains. Others are seeing what's happening and must be feeling embattled. I mean, there they go again, having a complaint about racism. Am I going to have to relinquish the little that I have and have worked hard for just because they're whining? Life's hard enough for me too. I'm a victim. I think I'd really underestimated the gulf in perception between the two sides. The discussion leaves viewers believing it's a they and them issue versus us and mine. And I was hoping to kickstart a discussion around a greater sense of who we are. What I can see is that there's so much anger flying around in this subject, it's possible for misperceptions to descend and get much worse. So the next time I or someone like me brings up something that could genuinely advance perspectives across all of British society, the danger of this slide into misperception is that whilst you can see my lips moving, the only thing you're going to be able to hear is "Cracker, watch out, I'm coming for your frame!" So instead, consider this an intervention. I really want these blogs to kickstart a dialogue in a spirit of calm and rational discussion of new information and greater understanding of. So I felt it apposite to start by addressing some of the key issues in the discussion that people may have felt I was being evasive about. One very popular quote that I remember from school is Benjamin Disraeli's "Lies, damn lies and statistics." But let me tackle the statistics issue head on, just so you know that I'm not being evasive. After a series of requests for statistics under the Freedom of Information Act, David Lammy made public that black applicants are broadly half as successful as their white counterparts at interview. 1 in 5 success rates are there for black students at Oxford, which drops to 1 in 6 at Cambridge, compared with a 1 in 3 success rate for white applicants. So the problem's not just one of too few black applicants. Even if the percentage of students may one day broadly mirror the British population, there's still an issue with too high a percentage perhaps being rejected. Moreover, the success rates based on 2010 figures show that 80% of Oxford's student populace is drawn from the uppermost 3 socioeconomic categories. That figures 89% at Cambridge, and the national average is only 66%. So the same factors that produce such a narrow demographic at Oxbridge may also be producing such a small black populace. Exactly what I said as I watched him. Funny how they only like statistics on their side and not the other. So, the second point to underline, and this is something that Michael Portillo actually made in the studio, that for that 13 and 14%, the vast majority of those students are not black British students, but many instances overseas students, Indian and Chinese students, people who wouldn't self-identify as black. So what I find interesting and really disingenuous is that they've chosen to widen the definition of black just to prove to you and me and everybody that racism doesn't exist, that it's all a phantom menace. But don't just take my word for it. Here's Adam Elliott Cooper, PhD student on Channel 4 News.
It's important to point out that 10% of that 13 to 14% of minority ethnic students are Indian and Chinese, rather than being Bangladeshi, Pakistani or African Caribbean. And I think the other thing that it's important to point out is that this campaign is really about not having a few black faces in high places, because black people have been attending Oxford since the 18th century. There's nothing really new about that. But it's about really fundamentally changing the institutional culture.
One of my major problems with this whole statistics discussion is that there's no nuanced analysis of the statistical information. So, based on my peers at Oxford, the vast majority of black and brown students were law or medicine students. There were exceptions like me who did history, geography, a few other historians and economists. But the vast majority chose subjects that had a direct vocational application, safer degrees. And traditionally, I believe West African and Asian students are often burdened by these needs to get proper and respectable jobs, rather than the loftier academic reasons for applying perhaps some other students. So what effect is that having on the faculty, on diverse narratives within geography, within history, within economics, when if there are black students, they may only be funneled down a very narrow academic path?
So there's no evidence, if you enlarge the category to include black and minority ethnic students in general, to think that that Oxford is guilty of racism, Russell Group universities are guilty of racism, or the higher education sector at large is guilty of racism.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many issues beyond just the number of black students that are at Oxford, not to mention a 23% pay gap with black graduates. What are these black graduates going to do once they've left Oxford if there's no work for them? It really comes back to the fact that this is all about changing perceptions of what Britishness is about and what black people's role within the British story is all about. If only there were other Oxford students and graduates saying similar things.
All of these things around statistics and what have you, I recently read a report that was written by Oxford University called 100 Black Voices about black students' experiences, and one of them recounts a photo shoot on their, at their college. And upon seeing the people who were involved in the photo shoots, one of the tutors said, "Oh, brilliant, a woman and an ethnic." And I think that experience kind of speaks to the kind of reductive, somewhat superficial approach to kind of putting a few black faces in high places, rather than the fundamental changes that the campaign.
Okay, well, the whole of society feeds you this one notion of who we are, and it's not conducive to us being paid the same. It's not conducive to us staying out of jail. When a policeman sees you, they have the same narratives. It's all about changing the way that black people are perceived in this country.
This all relates to tuition fees, and they're not mutually exclusive issues. To talk about black people being denied opportunities does not necessarily preclude you saying tuition fees are a problem too. They're both a problem. So let me try and restate the point I was making on this week. That for any aspirant black or Asian students going to Oxford, it's very unusual for them to look at indices and statistics of admission. It's far more likely they'll follow the example of a role model. I think it's interesting to see the way in which our modern media frames very important questions like this. Is it something that allows rational discourse and the discovery of new information, or is it something that invariably is just adversarial and everybody leaves not fully understanding the picture? So I'm on one sofa, and on the other side are my adversaries supposedly positing a completely different argument. When in actuality, Michael Portillo was saying some things that very much chimed with me.
Let's offer some sort of explanation on the disagreement about the figures. I mean, as I understand it, the ethnic minorities are very largely made up of students of Indian background, and it remains the case that black Caribbean and black African are represented by very small numbers. No.
Which brings me to the second contentious issue that was raised in the discussion. My own quote that Cecil Rhodes was a predatory paedophile. Now, I may have been wildly hyperbolic in comparing him to Jimmy Savile. This is not an official Rhodes must fall line, and I was speaking of my own volition, based on my own opinions, but these words had also come from Daily Mail reviews and the Independent's review of the BBC series, and that series that was based on the book by Anthony Thomas. The line that I took and ran with was that his primary interest, sexual interest, was in young boys. And after a cursory glance at Anthony Thomas's book, he may also have cultivated an interest in, quote, low, grubby women, also other South African prostitutes that are also anonymous. information's out there, but it's all very contradictory and conflicting. He may have been homosexual, he may have been asexual, he may have been a paedophile, he may have been into prostitutes. We just don't know. One thing I can definitely say is that a rapacious colonial mindset is very often tied to sexual exploitation. And abuse is often the grubby underbelly of colonial expansion. It's conveniently forgotten, but figures such as James Marion Sims or Thomas Jefferson attest to this sort of double standard. People are often deified for their deeds, whilst their behaviours towards a black mistress, victims of rape, trafficking, is merely considered collateral damage. My main objective in the short BBC film was not to highlight institutional racism, but instead to look at a more sclerotic attitude towards race in general that prevents us from changing attitudes, prevents us from growth. So across this entire debate, what I'd like to hear is less talk of victims and more discussion about survivors. Not whining, but transformation being the buzzword. And the conversation being a lot less combative and more informative. So in the next blogs, I'm going to address some very pertinent subjects that I think I can take some time to explain. White working class male underachievement, how that relates to colonialism and black underachievement, divide and conquer, why does Cecil Rhodes and his legacy still matter, and finally, what on earth do I mean by reframe British identity and history?